Let's Talk About was created to highlight important issues and bring back the art of conversation, because everybody has a story to tell, right? Let's talk about ADHD. The first interview in this podcast is with Dr. Tony Lloyd, who's CEO of the ADHD Foundation UK. Tony is also a child and adolescent psychotherapist who has the condition himself.
Hi, Nicky.
Hi, how you doing? If someone said to you, ADHD is just naughty young boys, what would you say to them?
I would tell them that they were ill-informed and completely mistaken about their understanding of what ADHD is and isn't.
Okay, so what would you say to them if they knew nothing about it?
I would explain to them that ADHD is a naturally occurring phenomenon across the whole spectrum of human neurocognitive capacity, that the fact that 1 in 20 people have ADHD, the fact that 1 in 5 people are neurodiverse or neurodivergent, so ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, I would say that from an evolutionary perspective, there is a purpose and a reason why there is neurodiversity and why 20% of the human population have brains that are structurally and functionally different, and that if they understood that, and they understood that in the context of our educational paradigm of the 19th century, which has a rather narrow view of what intelligence and ability is and how we measure it, then they would realise that a lot of the stigmatising, stereotyping, deficit-based concepts around people who are neurodiverse would change their perspective completely, because they're probably surrounded by people who are neurodivergent and they don't even know it. But they don't see them because we are brought up to believe in this term called special educational needs, which is where children are given the mark of Cain at 5 and defined as low ability, low intelligence, purely and simply because they learn in a different way. And unfortunately, that 19th century paradigm has persisted for a couple of centuries. However, in the 21st century, all the major growth industries, all the biggest industries that are influencing our culture, our commerce, our employment market, our lifestyles, such as technology, bioscience, engineering, robotics, internet, web-based kind of industries, they've been recruiting neurodiverse employees for over 20 years. So what is it about them that recognises this talent and ability that our education system doesn't?
Yeah, exactly. I'd like to know. So you think the misunderstanding just stems from way back, and it's just, I mean, with information at our fingertips, it baffles me that it's still so widely misunderstood and still stigmatised. I don't understand.
I think it also, I mean, there are two issues here, I think, Nicky. One is language and the evolving of language. So if we look at some of the etiology around the medical language, anybody who was on the end of a standard distribution curve was considered abnormal. But then, it wasn't that long ago that we taught children who were left-handed to write with their right hands by tying their left hand to their chair, or that we defined children of mixed race as educationally subnormal. There is, I think, still some slightly eugenicist thinking around what we think intelligence and ability is. And I think there are probably some people who would like to think that, that this is genetic. And while we know these different minds are genetic, for me, impairment or advantage is very much context specific. So how could we talk about intelligence and ability and employability without looking at it in the context of our environment and the fact that our environment is changing rapidly, and that we live in a complex world where we can be moving in and out of multiple environments in any given day, where what is demanded of our neurology is different from one meeting to the next, as we have just experienced.
Okay, so I interviewed Lorna Fotheringham from the Perth ADHD group, and she said about the negative effects that she sees parents coming in that they've experienced with stigma and they feel judged. So do you think that makes people reluctant to try and get a diagnosis or try and get help for their child sometimes?
Yes, it certainly puts a lot of adults off because they will struggle, but they won't identify with the stereotype. So they will go through their lives thinking, okay, I've got difficulty concentrating, and I am forgetful, and I've got poor executive functioning skills, if they know that that's what it is. I have a pervasive kind of anxiety. I experience depression sometimes, my social and communication skills, but I am not a naughty, feral child, so and I'm academically gifted, and I've got a degree, so I can't possibly have ADHD, which we know is complete and utter nonsense. I did a degree, 2 diplomas, 2 master's degrees and a PhD without meds. So yes, it certainly does for adults, but I also think for parents, and I think also particularly in Scotland, because there is, I think, a trend, certainly amongst educational psychologists who, in Scotland, I know that the educational psychology professionals are very outspoken about what they call the medicalisation of children or childhood and the overuse of pharmacology in childhood, which I agree with. However, to say that ADHD is caused by adverse childhood experiences or trauma completely denies the science about what we understand about the neurogenesis and the genetic differences in ADHD brains and autism brains and dyslexia, all of those differences of which overlap, so we know that they frequently co-occur. That I think it's a thing that is perhaps more of an issue in Scotland than it is in England, where well-intentioned educational psychologists are arguing against children having a diagnosis of ADHD because they see it as pathologizing and because they think ADHD medication is overused when there is no evidence for that, by the way, and that we have less than 1% diagnosed in Scotland as opposed to 3% in the UK. And that actually a lot of children are being denied access to the support they need, including pharmacology for those who need it, based on a misunderstanding that the pharmacology has some kind of moral imperative, i.e. it's to help children behave. That is absolutely not what it is designed for. That was never what it was designed for. It was designed to improve cognitive functioning. And pharmacologically, it's one of the most effective compounds that's ever been invented. It has an effect size of 0.9, which compare that to Prozac, which is 0.4.
It's strange. It's strange that you say that, because obviously that's all we get offered up here. If your child is diagnosed, you offer medication and that's it. Then you're just discharged.
And unfortunately, because nobody in Scotland and not many people in England are following the SIGN guidelines in Scotland or the NICE guidelines in England that state management of ADHD should be multimodal. Yes, medication is the first line of treatment. It's cheap and it's effective. Non-pharmacological interventions, like parent programs that are ADHD specific, not generic parenting programs, have an effect size of about, between 0.2 and 0.4. Similarly for cognitive behavioural therapies, similarly for stress reduction strategies, for mindfulness, and all these other tools that should form part of a toolkit for everybody. But I think this is an issue about our medical model, isn't it? It's this idea that, there is something wrong with you, and I'm going to give you medication, and I am treating you for what is wrong with you. I think a neurodiverse paradigm argues that you're not errors of genetics or disordered. There is an evolutionary purpose as to why 1 in 5 people are neurodiverse, and an evolutionary purpose as to why 1 in 20 have ADHD, and that there are some things for some human beings that are more challenging in a certain context, where whatever our environment is asking of us is overwhelming for us. It's not something that we're particularly good at. And that causes learner anxiety. And learner anxiety in children every day results in a pervasive and overuse of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline to support concentration, when adrenaline and cortisol should only ever be used to support cognitive functioning in a high-pressure situation because it's part of our fight-or-flight response. But if as a child you are being called upon every day from the age of 5 to concentrate and sit still and focus and hold lots of things in working memory, when this is something that your brain doesn't do as well, it will create pervasive anxiety. You will misuse adrenaline and cortisol, and that will hardwire your brain to be hypervigilant and have a hypersensitive stress response, because in puberty your brain goes through that major growth spurt where it reflects in this very instinctive, unconscious way on what its environment has been since it was born, and it will program that major growth spurt of the brain in puberty in a way that prepares you for your environment in adult life. And if your experience throughout childhood has been one of pervasive anxiety because your environment is overwhelming you, then your brain is going to be programmed to be in a world that requires a greater degree of hypervigilance and readiness to respond to a perceived threat.
Yeah, I relate.
So if I know it was a bit of a long-winded answer, Nicky, but the tragedy there is then, by denying children access to a medication that will improve their cognitive functioning in the classroom, reduce their anxiety, help them learn and achieve and get a good education, which we know is the only or the major factor in terms of life chances, certainly socioeconomic ones, but we also know that all the research tells us that medication in childhood reduces the risk of smoking, addiction, anxiety, depression, self-harm in adult life. Whether you stop taking them as an adult or not, we know that intervening and offering that support in childhood makes a significant difference to life chances. And what I'd like to say to the professionals in Scotland who deny that ADHD is real, well, first of all, I would say there is an issue of professionalism here for you, because whether you agree with it or not, it's a diagnostic entity, it's in DSM-5, it's in ECD-10, and you are breaking the law if you are telling people it doesn't exist, because you are refuting something that under the Equalities Act you are legally obliged to acknowledge, even if your personal opinion is that it doesn't exist. And the analogy I always draw is, do you wear glasses? Yeah. And if I took your glasses off you, would you be able to do your job? Would you have been able to get through school? No. So the glasses helps to remove the impairment. Glasses are safe. It doesn't mean to say that your vision isn't still impaired, but I'm removing the impairment by giving you glasses.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying when it comes to ADHD, medication is a very effective tool, but it should never be used in isolation. It is not a cure. It's not a neurological El Dorado. It is one of a whole range of strategies that will enable a child to manage and cope with the demands of their environment. So if we are going to socialize and educate children the way we do, then you're going to have to give them the means by which they can access that education. And if you're not going to do that, then by asking them to go to school every day and follow our national curriculum and be part of this culture that exists within our education system, then quite frankly, I think that's cruel. So there are a couple of options here, aren't there? We train our children's workforce, particularly the education workforce, to understand children and to understand neurodivergent learning, not just the content of the national curriculum and how to get an A grade. We challenge the culture within our school that says these different minds are somehow less than. We challenge the model of measurement where, however we view neurodiverse children, they are always viewed as somehow less than. They are defined by what they cannot do rather than what they can do. And we skill up parents and train parents and help parents understand how to understand and meet the needs of their child and their child's unique neurology.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask that because I've got a bit of a controversial question, but it's because it's coming from my point of view as a parent that was undiagnosed and then as a parent that is now diagnosed, and what I've learnt as well. My question was, do you think an undiagnosed parent with ADHD can effectively parent a child with a neurodiverse condition?
I would say that if a parent has ADHD, they need, and it's often the case, that adults learn they have ADHD when their child's gone through the process. The research evidence suggests that it's better for the child if the parent understands and owns their ADHD and learns to manage their own ADHD, because that will improve the efficacy of their parenting. I think parents who can't manage their ADHD will not be able to meet their child's needs.
Everybody's still alive.
And there is research evidence that suggests that parents with unmanaged ADHD are more likely to have children who develop oppositional defiant disorder. And oppositional defiant disorder is a psychiatric term. ADHD, again, this is where a lot of people in Scotland have a problem, is not a behavioural disorder. It's a neurodevelopmental condition or difference. So I'm not anti-medical model, and I'm not completely social theory model of disability. I don't even like the term disability, and I don't like the term special educational needs, because for me they connote a patronising, deficit-based, stigmatising perception of 1/5 of the human population just because they are different. And I think there is an issue here around inclusion and diversity in the same way that we've explored these issues around race and sexual orientation and physical disability, that there is pervasive cultural prejudice around this, not through ill intent, but through being ill-informed. And I think, when adults say to me, I think I've got ADHD, what should I do? And I would say, learn, find out, from the people around you, reflect on your childhood. So unless you've got epilepsy and had a brain injury, it would have been evident in childhood. Look at the facts about what it is and what it isn't. And if you think you've got ADHD, ask yourself, am I managing okay? Because many people do. Many people don't feel the need to go to a doctor and get a formal diagnosis and get medication. What I would say is, do not see yourself as disordered. Play to your strengths and develop strategies to manage those areas of your life that you find more difficult because of your ADHD. Not because you haven't tried, or because you don't exercise, or you don't look after yourself, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm very concerned that people would hang any of their failures, mistakes, or competency issues on a diagnosis. I don't think that's helpful. It's abdicating responsibility for your health, your well-being, your behaviour, your choices as an adult.
Yeah.
ADHD, if you think about ADHD's core characteristics and the secondary characteristics of poor executive functioning skills and anxiety and so on, these are all, how I explain this to teachers is, show me a child who isn't impulsive, show me a child who isn't inattentive, show me a child who isn't hyperactive. All children are. So what makes some children ADHD is when those naturally occurring human characteristics are in a slightly more extreme form and pass a threshold that somebody has decided constitutes a significant degree of impairment to justify the use of the term disorder in medical language. If you can manage your life in such a way that your ADHD is less impairing, then good for you. Because if you're happy and you're thriving and you have all of these different strategies, great. Probably don't need to use medication. But for some people, they do, and don't judge them because of that. And I don't understand why there is all this ignorance and stigma around ADHD medication, which is only used by less than 1% of the population in the UK, when over 20% of the population are taking antidepressants.
Yeah.
It's about stigma and ignorance and cultural, pervasive myths in our cultural perception of both pharmacology, but also in terms of how we view anybody whose mind is slightly different from ours.
Yeah, difference is always scary, I think, in any way, shape or form. I can see why people think like that, but it's not acceptable. Not from my point of view anyway. So do you think adults with the condition are like well supported? I mean, I've got a lot of friends that are adults that have been, no, there's nothing, is there? Once you turn 18, bye-bye.
It's appalling. And it's much worse in Scotland. And again, I think some of this is about this whole thing, particularly amongst the educational psychologists in Scotland, that is so anti-ADHD or says it doesn't exist and it's all about ACEs. I find really unhelpful. I think it's well-intentioned but harmful to deny the fact that there are people who have different minds. We don't deny the existence of dyslexia or autism. And the tragedy there is as well that over 60% of people with autism also have ADHD. So why is that okay? Yeah. Just having ADHD is not. It just defies all logic. And I think it lacks empathy or compassion based on a well-intentioned position point about over-medicalising children or the overuse of pharmacology. 1 in 5 human beings have different minds that are exceptional at some things, but unfortunately within our education system and our educational paradigm and our model of measuring intelligence and ability, which we pretty much defined in the 19th century, that paradigm actually completely excludes 20%. Not because they're not intelligent, not because they're not able or employable, but because their brains don't fit our particular model or concept of intelligence and how we measure it, which was probably a good model in the 19th century when we didn't have technology and the world was very different and the employment market was very different and children finished school at 12. But this is the 21st century and that paradigm is completely context inappropriate now for the 21st century. And evidence of that is, well, industry, even MI6 and GCHQ are now actively recruiting neurodiverse employees because they know that their brains can do things that the 80% of the neurotypical population can't. So what is it that industry sees that our education system doesn't? What is it that the world sees in terms of what it needs and how it progresses and develops that our education system is ignoring?
Well, I mean, I think they don't recognise... I mean, having homeschooled my child now for the last few months, given the pandemic, I've realised that it's regurgitating information. He looks at that information, he tries to remember it, which obviously he can't do because he's got ADHD, and then if he can't remember it, he'll fail at exams, he won't achieve. I mean, how is that even... That's not education, that's being like a parrot. That's just remembering information and then regurgitating it. That's not education. To me, education is learning and evolving.
Because some people have a notion that intelligence is one thing or a certain type of thing. And the people who are going to, the people who are going to support that paradigm are the people who've thrived in it.
Yeah.
Well, it worked for me. Just because it doesn't work for you, it's like saying, it's that old adage, isn't it? It's like saying to somebody in a wheelchair, well, just because you haven't got legs. But in an information technology age where everybody has access to every library in the world in the form of a smartphone at the end of their hand, having a good memory is not as important now, and therefore, given our understanding of neuroscience, given the fact that we live in a very different world with a very different job market, with children who develop much quicker, and why are we still using this model from the 19th century when actually it's not a good fit for the 21st century? And I'm not being critical of teachers here. I've been married to one for 25 years. But, I find it horrifying, really, when a student goes and does a postgraduate certificate in education, they have 8 months to train to be a teacher. They spend 4 months in school, and they spend 4 months learning how to deal with national curriculum. And they get 1-2 days at the most on child and adolescent mental health, developmental psychology, the neuroscience of learning, and this term special educational needs. What profession in the world would you train somebody for 2 days?
Yeah, especially when they've got classrooms full of these children there.
Yeah, and it is inhumane to inflict an educational system on 20% of children that we know potentially harms their well-being and their neurological development and their mental health and their potential economic independence. Why? Because somebody said, well, only my type of intelligence or ability really matters. And I'm going to cling on to this because that's what's made me successful. It's got to change because industry, the market, demands it.
Yeah.
And interestingly, and what is really powerful is I am hearing more and more young people saying, stop saying I've got low ability. Don't put me in the bottom set. Don't call me special needs just because I don't fit your view of intelligence and ability. And then you look at the research, like 35% of entrepreneurs have either got ADHD or dyslexia or both. Who's missing something here?
Yeah, totally agree. Based on that, what do we need to do going forward? What is the plan to get this thing changed?
We have to give young people a voice. We have to educate people. There really needs to be a public health campaign about ADHD, about what it is and what it isn't. And that then should influence how we train the children's workforce and also how we train primary care practitioners, i.e. GPs, because here's the other thing, there's an economic argument here. We know that undiagnosed, unmanaged ADHD correlates with eating disorders, obesity, increased risk of type 2 diabetes, increased risk of anxiety and depression, which if compounded with trauma can cause bipolar. We know it correlates with increased risk of addiction, self-harm, attempted suicide, economic dependency upon the state. There are 1,000,001 reasons.
There's a lot of prisoners as well, isn't there? There's a lot of people in prison.
Over 20%.
Yeah.
We have got to ask ourselves why, if it doesn't make economic sense, if it doesn't make moral sense, if it's wasting talent and ability, why are we still approaching ADHD in this way? And like I said, I don't think ADHD is, the term needs to be changed. I don't feel comfortable when people claim ADHD as an identity. In the same way somebody says, well, I'm autistic. And I think, well, does it define you? Is it a facet of you? I don't go around introducing myself to, I'm black or I'm gay or I'm dyslexic. So ADHD is a part of who we are. It's not an excuse for not taking responsibility for our lives. But I would argue, how can you expect anybody to take responsibility for themselves if they don't know, A, why they're struggling, or B, given the information so that they can take responsibility for their well-being, for their learning, for their employment opportunities, for their economic independence. It's no different from denying somebody in a wheelchair a ramp in order to access a building. And I just think we live in a world where the environmental demands on children now are so different and so great. And if you look at the data, and this is the official data, 7% of children in the UK have attempted suicide. 7%.
Yeah. And
1 in 4 have self-harmed. What on God's earth are we doing to our children? That is their response to the world that they live in.
We're not listening to them.
Look at the number of children who are excluded. Look at the number of children who are off-road. Look at the number of children who are labelled feral, defiant. In other words, it's not the fact that my teaching isn't good. It's not the fact that the curriculum isn't relevant. It's not the fact that you've got to wait 3 years to get to a health service appointment. It's because there's something wrong with you. It abdicates me of any responsibility to change anything. Yeah. If I can say, the problem is yours.
I think you do need a lot of understanding, don't you? And that's lacking.
Yeah, but it's about education.
It has to start there, because that's where the kids are when they start getting diagnosed, because it's not till they get to school and they have to conform that there's a problem.
And that will only happen if there is legislation, and legislation will only happen if people speak out. And unfortunately, if you are a minority, your voice isn't very loud.